you're a fan of Five Nights at Freddy's, you've probably heard of the term Remnant. And if you have heard anything about it beyond that, you may have ended up confused by the concept. It seems like no one ever really knows how to properly explain what it is, and sometimes you'll get differing answers. So how can we actually solve this once and for all? Well, I'm glad to tell you that I know exactly how to, and that is by reading the word. Google, what is the definition of remnant? A small remaining quantity of something. Similar, remains, remainder, leftovers, leavings, residue, rest, stub. So that seems simple enough. Remnant means the remainder of something. That makes sense, it's in the name. So now let's ask ourselves the question, what is FNAF about? Broad question, I know. But really, you'd agree with me if I said it was about ghosts, right? So how can we connect the word remnant with ghosts? Easily. Remnant, in the context of FNAF, is the remainder of a person after death, aka their spirit. It's literally what remains of them, and well, that's it. You've probably heard the term soul juice thrown around. Where exactly did this come from? Well, if we turn to the fourth closet, here we can see William Afton melting the haunted endoskeletons down into a liquid form, to then take this substance and inject it into the fun times. As a result of this, the spirits then transfer to these new vessels, giving them life. Is this substance remnant? Well, you may be shocked to hear that the term remnant is never uttered once in the entirety of this book. But yes, remnant is present here, obviously, because it is the soul. As I said, the souls, or in other words, the remnant of the children, inhabited these new vessels. Asking if you could call the melted metal remnant is the same thing as asking if you could call that the soul. The remnant haunts the endoskeletons, and when those endoskeletons change from solid to liquid, they're still haunted. They didn't cease to exist, they've just changed form, so it makes sense. The souls are inside that liquid, or the remnant is inside that liquid. Wherever it goes, the remnant follows, allowing newer vessels to be possessed by force. We were also officially given a definition of remnant by a man named Dr. Talbert in the final epilogue of Fazbear Frights. I'll just quickly break this down. In non-scientific terms, it's like the metal is haunted. Right, I said this. It's more complicated than that, of course, but it's similar to the way water conducts electricity. So the analogy here is water being such a strong conductor of electricity, like the spirit is coursing through the metal. The soul is being compared to a sort of energy, and the metal is the thing conducting or housing it, which is why the endoskeletons were possessed. Remnant is the mixing of the tangible with the intangible, or things that aren't physical, the soul, possessing something that is physical, an animatronic or whatever other object. Of memory with the present, or someone you remember who's now dead, appearing to you currently as a ghost. The people and things that are lost, it makes them almost real again. Note the wording of almost real, because a ghost is not a real person who is alive and breathing, but is rather the remnants or the memory of one. Now this time I said remnants instead of remnant. I changed it to plural because there's another concept in FNAF that I want to touch on. Let's go back to Sister Location. Sister Location is the story of Michael Afton going down to Circus Baby's entertainment and rental in order to find and free his sister, at the request of William Afton, his father, which is explained to us in his monologue during the final cutscene of Custom Night. But he also says something very interesting here. I put her back together just like you asked me to. This is obviously reminiscent of the final cutscene of FNAF 4 where the bite victim is told, "You're broken, I will put you back together." So the question you may be wondering is, what does that mean? And in response, I am once again going to ask you to simply read the sentence. Google, what is the definition of... No, I don't need to do that. Look at the words. You're broken. I will put you back together. If something is broken and needs to be put back together, I don't think you need to search a dictionary to comprehend this sentence if you can simply understand the English language. You know what the words mean. The only question is, once again, what does this mean under the context of FNAF specifically? You remember that FNAF is a story about ghosts, right? So how do we correlate ghosts and the idea of being put back together? Well, let's once again look at the fourth closet. At the end of the book, we have a scene where the character Carlton is injected with the molten metal, and for the sake of simplicity, I will refer to it as Remnant, as the Ultimate Guide does so anyways. Remember that this remnant belongs to the children. It has their souls, so this connects Carlton's own soul to them, leading to him waking up in a spiritual realm where he can see and interact with the children. The spirit belonging to Golden Freddy, a boy named Michael, tells Carlton that he has to put his friends back together because they are all in pieces. If you watch the scene unfold, or read it, as this is not visually portrayed in the graphic novel, This is in fact very literal. Carlton can see duplicates of the children running around. Each child is literally in pieces. We are also shown why. As Afton takes more of the remnant and injects it into something else, it's splitting the souls apart because they're now existing in multiple places at once. They still inhabit the melted mass of the original endoskeletons, but they're also possessing the fun times and other robots like those weird little clown things. As this has happened, they've forgotten themselves more and more and can't even remember their own killer, and Afton has taken advantage of this and manipulated them into believing he's their friend. As Carlton helps Michael bring the drawings, symbolic of the pieces of their souls, together, the children start to become whole. The one issue that remains is they still don't realize who Afton is, so Carlton has to change one of the drawings, overriding their false memories in order to fix this. Now, all the remnant concentrates back into one place, the original vessels, and the children turn on Afton, killing him for good. What happens after this is something I believe also happened at the end of Sister Location. When Michael was injected by the scooper with the children's remnant, it transported him into a realm where he could interact with the spirits. This is where I helped Elizabeth realize who she really was. He combined her memories of her being killed by Baby and Baby's memories of killing Elizabeth into one, so she could recognize herself as being one entity, thus putting her/her memories back together and making her whole. However, in the fourth closet, after being injected with molten metal to the heart, Carlton cannot survive this, and Michael has to leave a piece of his own soul with Carlton with the intention of using it to keep him alive. Michael, as in Michael Afton, also would have died had it not been for Elizabeth, who repeatedly says you won't die, leaving a piece of herself with him with the intent to keep him alive. Thus, his corpse comes back to life. So notice how there was a big focus on memories here. The pieces of the children's souls are connected to these drawings, which act as the memories of the children that need to be corrected. All the way back at the start of the Silver Eyes, there's a quote that connects ghosts with memories. Marla looked around at her friends. "What?" she said defensively. "I don't believe in ghosts." "I do," Charlie said. She felt like she was talking from a great distance. She was almost surprised they could hear her. "I mean, not ghosts, but memories. I think they linger, whether there's someone there or not." The house, her old house, was imbued with memory, with loss, with longing. It hung in the air like humidity. The walls were saturated, like the wood had soaked in it. It had been there before she came, and it was there now. It would be there forever. It had to be. There was too much, too great and vast a weight for Charlie to have brought it with her. "That doesn't make any sense," Jessica said. "Memory is in our brains, like literally stored in the brain. You can see it on a scan. It can't exist outside of someone's mind." "I don't know," John said. "Think of all the places that have atmosphere. Old houses, sometimes places where you walk in and you feel sad or nostalgic, even though you've never been there before." "Maybe they are," Marla said. "I don't know. Sometimes I have little moments where it's like there's something I forgot, something I regret, or that I'm happy about, or something that makes me want to cry. But it's only there for a split second, then it's gone. Maybe we're all shedding our fear and regret and hope everywhere we go, and we're catching traces of people we've never met. Maybe it's everywhere." Similarly, the idea of a person's essence spreading out from them and leaving an impact on the world around them without being physically there is touched on in the Fazbear Fright series as well. Haunted was not a term he himself used, usually used as a word to refer to something embodied by a ghost. The word could also mean part of what Phineas knew to be true of all things. Haunted could mean showing signs of torment or some kind of mental anguish, and this was the more important definition of the word. These items on Phineas's shelves weren't possessed by ghosts. The ones that were truly haunted were energized by agony. "Not quite," Phineas straightened and clasped his hands. "You see, I'm convinced that agony has a greater energetic radius and power than any other emotion. I've done numerous experiments to measure, capture, contain, and study the leftover emotion embedded into objects that were near a tragedy. My work is focused on my hypothesis that you can take a saturation of agony and any kind of intelligence, even an artificial one, and they will combine together to transmute the energy of emotion into the energy of physical action. This, I believe, is what explains what people call haunted objects." Notice how the Silver Eyes uses the terminology of memory soaking into items, like they're saturated with it. In Fazbear Frights, this terminology returns with emotional energy, saying you can take a saturation of agony, and here it says the agony it had soaked in from the other items. Now, Phineas is correct about emotions being able to haunt items, but his disbelief in ghosts is his downfall. He doesn't realize the concepts of ghosts and emotional energy are connected, and that the items are given actual spiritual life. That's why his mental shield doesn't work against Stitch Wraith. A mere mental shield was never going to work against actual ghosts. Another thing worth noting is that in FNAF AR Special Delivery you can collect Remnant in the game. Here, the Remnant, or the parts of the soul, are represented as glowing orbs, an actual trope of how spirits have been portrayed in fictional media or folklore. Ever heard of the Will-o'-the-Wisp? There is both light and dark Remnant, and given what I've just talked about, it's evident why. As the Ultimate Guide states, light Remnant is formed from positive emotions, while dark Remnant is formed from negative ones. It also likes to mention that the room fills with ethereal whispering, which would be coming from, the ghosts. What we can learn from this is that ghosts in FNAF are the essence that makes up a person, being their emotions and their memories. I've realized that by this point, I'm starting to delve into an aspect of Remnant that is not self-explanatory, and you would need to thoroughly analyze different corners of FNAF to recognize this theme I'm getting into and understand it. However, this is my first video essay of all time, and I'm doing it on Remnant of all things, a concept in FNAF's world and story that I've studied and been passionate about for a very long time, so I'm going to take the chance to dive deep here, whether you like it or not. I have explained Remnant from a practical standpoint, and now I'm going to dedicate this section of the video to explaining it from a thematic standpoint, because Remnant is not just an explanation on how possession works in FNAF's universe, it is also the core theme of the entire series. Looking back at this image, we can now determine that "you're broken" is in reference to the soul. The bite victim has a broken spirit. But if I take this term, a broken spirit, out of the context of FNAF, what kind of a meaning does that have? Let's turn to the Fazbear Fright story, The Cliffs, of all places. After he had dropped off Tyler, he went to work, only nodding at colleagues who greeted him with "good morning." He didn't want to seem rude, but he didn't want to get into a conversation either. His own reactions were too unpredictable. Once he started talking, what would he say? Would he get all emotional in front of someone he didn't even know very well? Would he break down entirely? And if he did break down, what if he wasn't able to put the pieces back together? In this story, the main character, Robert, is a broken man. He's not broken in a literal sense, rather in a metaphorical sense, but the same terminology gets used here that was in FNAF 4, about being broken and needing to be put back together. The bite victim is also a broken-spirited person, not just literally, but in the same metaphorical sense. I mean, his other title is The Crying Child. He literally cried everywhere he walked. He was fearful of everything and constantly bullied by his older brother. I'm sure this kind of a life, especially as a young child, would break anyone's spirit. But remember what we learned about emotions, especially negative ones, having the power to seep out into the environment around them, infecting objects or leaving some sort of imprint on reality. If he was crying from distress in all these different places, when he walked away, would he not be leaving a piece of that distress, or a piece of himself, behind? After the bite victim is broken, the pieces of him need to be put back together. But where are these pieces? Let's actually go even further back and take a look at FNAF 3. Now this image might seem like nothing at first, but let's take a look at the comparisons being made here between the minigames of FNAF 3 and the minigames of FNAF 4. You have Balloon Boy and the kid holding the balloon, the tiny toy Chica, the bite victim in the same pose as the puppet, the inclusion of Mangle, not shown in this particular image, and Fredbear's stage, the shadow animatronics, and the layout of Happiest Day matching the layout of Fredbear's but in reverse. Notice the placement of the door, the colorful balloons, and the line of 3 tables leading to the children celebrating the party, albeit in very different ways. Happiest Day was about taking the horrific memories of the bite victim's party and turning it around into something happy, giving him the closure he needed. This is akin to a concept we also see in Fazbear Frights. Jake didn't know why he was getting a glimpse into the man's past, but he liked it. The scene was so heartwarming. All of the sadness that had weighed on him over the past few days began to disappear until the scene abruptly changed. Suddenly, the dining room was gone, and Jake was yanked harshly through what he figured were the man's memories. At eye-boggling super speed, Jake watched the man go to work, come home, play with his kids, have dates with his wife, and go on trips with his whole family. It was like riding a fast train through an amusement park. But then the happy train crashed. It was a real crash, real for the man anyway. Jake's good feelings collapsed into grief as he watched the man crawl from the wreckage of his family van. He wailed in despair as emergency workers pulled his dead family one by one from the crumpled metal. Jake concentrated and he sent his thoughts back through the soup of memories he'd just seen. Maybe he could pull one out, a good one, and make it bigger and brighter than the rest. If he could ease the man's pain. He had to try. Jake knew exactly which memory to make the biggest. It was the first one. the happy family dinner. Jake put all his focus on that memory. He pushed his intention into it so it puffed up in his mind. It was almost like blowing up a balloon, only the balloon was a memory and the air was Jake's will. Jake made the memory bigger and bigger, and then he gently suggested it back to the man's unconscious mind. In a way, he put the man's mind inside the bubble of that one happy scene. Jake was able to reach into a man's memories, a broken man who had suffered a horrific loss, and envelop him in a happy memory, giving him some sort of peace. The bite victim refers to the plushies of the animatronics as his friends. In his final moments, the bullies wearing the masks of his friends laugh at and tease him until he dies. In his bad memory turned good, the children, wearing the masks of his friends, are instead celebrating with him, giving him the party he never had. We are still your friends. Do you still believe that? The idea of his friends has become synonymous with whatever dons the appearance of them. Thus, each FNAF 3 secret minigame, which correlates with the memories of the bite victim, contains one of the souls of the children that you save by also giving cake to, because the bite victim and the children are inherently connected. Bite victim lives on in the pieces he left behind, which have connected to his friends, who are now also these children. As I stated before, we witness the children's souls break apart in the fourth closet, as William Afton injects the remnant into the fun times, spreading them out across multiple vessels. The same is true in Sister Location. The remnant of the dead children has brought these animatronics to life at the cost of their own memories becoming broken. By the end of the game, the fun times shed their shells and fuse their endoskeletons together into one entity, becoming the pieces put together, Ennard. Since each child contains a piece of the bite victim, this also metaphorically puts the bite victim back together, even topping him off with a little birthday hat. The remains of Ennard also show up in FNAF 6 as Molten Freddy, whose classic lines such as, "Thanks for letting me join the party," will try not to disappoint. Funny that the whole game is actually leading up to some important party that everyone needs to be there for. All of these little souls in one place, just for us. A gift. Now we can do what we were created to do and be complete. Within the FNAF 6 location are the pieces put together. Every last remaining memory of Freddy's contained in one place, all of the remaining spirits. This doesn't just give closure to them, but also to what they represent when they're together, being the bite victim, whose soul had spread and infected the different parts of the franchise. The memory of everything that started this can finally begin to fade away, as the agony of every tragedy should. And what happens when agony doesn't fade? Just how powerful can Dark Remnant get? It's time to turn to the fourth closet yet again, particularly the character of Elizabeth in this story. As you may know, and if you don't, you'll just have to really bear with me here, the Charlie bots were brought to life with Henry's emotion. This is another perfect example of someone leaving a piece of themselves behind. Henry embedded into his creation the grief, but also the love he had for his daughter he had lost. This is actually one of the most underrated and one of my favorite aspects of this story. The fact that Henry was the one treating a doll or a robot like his real daughter and loved her as if she was, but his sister Jen was trying to break him out of this illusion and make him face reality. When Henry finally sees through his delusion and ends his own life, Jen has now made the realization that this Charlie has become real, a real girl who's alive and feels emotion, and opts to take care of her as a genuine family member, even saying in her own final moments, "I've always loved you, Charlie." But then there's Elizabeth. The final body Henry made, an adult version of Charlie, was instead imbued with rage. Henry was starting to realize he had lost his sanity by now, and created her out of sheer anger. She was not created out of the intention of Henry returning his loving daughter to him, but was created during the realization that she was really and truly gone. And so, this thing did not become Charlie. Unfinished and abandoned, she was stolen by Afton to be modified into his own killing machine. Afton's own daughter, Elizabeth, got too close and was killed by her. This robot, baby, realizes what she really is, the combined emotions of a raging father, the memories of a neglected young girl, and the intention of a machine made to kill. This is why Afton, throughout the course of not just this book, but all three of them, has such an interest in Charlie, but does not consider Elizabeth good enough, despite the fact that they're both machines who were given life. Elizabeth is a mismatch of multiple elements coming together, but Charlie is a pure soul. She is not possessed by the spirit of a dead child. She is a shard of her father's soul left behind that has taken on a life of its own and developed into its own person. This is a fascinating concept, with the allure of potentially immortalizing your soul and leaving behind a legacy. Afton does not believe Henry deserved to discover this because it was by accident. He wants to understand how it happened and how to recreate it, which, by the way, never happens. Because as Jessica says, William Afton never made anything with love. Henry was able to give life through the love for what he had lost. William cannot do this because he cannot love. He doesn't have the capability of pouring himself into something on an emotional level, and instead tries to brute force this process by physically removing pieces of himself and inserting them into his amalgamation. So I just want to say, I don't want to hear anything about there possibly being a bunch of robot kids that just exist in this universe because Afton decided to build an army or something. And the entire point of this trilogy is showing why this is something that Afton cannot do. He cannot recreate what Henry did. His goal is to understand life, cheat death, unify and control his victims, then use them to ascend, and he fails. At least, he does in this continuity. So, back to Fazbear Frights, specifically the man in room 1280. At the end of this story, Afton's body is taken to the Fazbear Entertainment Distribution Center, where he proceeds to, for lack of a better word, explode, and his evil, which has contaminated one of his victims, Andrew, spreads out and infects all of the objects in the area. This ends up kickstarting a lot of the events that take place in these stories, since some of the antagonists are actually infected items that came from the center. While Andrew claims to be the one who did all of this, the reveal is that he actually carried pieces of Afton's soul that he let spread across all these items. Now that all the items have been collected and brought together in one place, being a trash compactor in this context, it also puts Afton back together. Then, out of the nearly fully compressed junk, the contorted but identifiable shape of what looked like a burned skeletal man thrust upward. With ashy, see-through skin that revealed dried up but still quivering organs, the man-thing looked like a creature from hell. Its limbs broken and bursting through the cracked skin, its face misshapen, its torso twisted, the creature took shape while Jake watched. The rest of the trash from the compactor continued its transfiguration. It formed itself out of animatronic body parts, but not in any logical way. They were joining all haywire. Heads were being used as joints, arms as legs, and legs as arms. A torso formed from the hips and chest and belly of 3 animatronics, but each part was put in the wrong place. Hands were inserted at random all over the structure. Woven through all of these misplaced pieces were wires and gears, which created a labyrinthine circulatory system connecting hinges to gears and screws and nails to eyes and noses and mouths. With each additional piece clamping into place, the miscreation stood taller and taller until it was nearly 15 feet tall. Then, looming over the detective, it leaned to the side and lifted a macabre head up to a neck made from shins. The moment the rabbit-shaped fusion of trash met Larson's gaze, Larson was able to accept what he'd known when he'd first watched the monster put itself together. The thing was Afton. By the way, I just want to say I love that it refers to this thing as the miscreation, which I will always stand by being the superior name, as the concept of this entity is very much the antithesis to the joy of creation. There was no joy and love that went into creating this thing. It's a being of pure malice and agony. It's evil combined with the memories of the tragedies that those objects resulted in. It has the remnants of both Afton and the remnants of the suffering that he caused. This is the closest Afton ever got to achieving his goal. He did successfully merge himself with pieces from his victims into the singular giant mass. He's no longer just a cause of agony. He declares himself as the very concept of agony. He's ascended into something beyond human, into a being that can only be comprehended as the very idea of anguish and torment. You may think of a creature like this as being Satan, but here, Afton sees himself as God. It's all the more sweet that the one to take him down is the puppet, the very first victim he took, an action that would lead him to this point after years of trying to deceive humanity and then ascend it, only for him to fall back into pieces that descend to the bottom of the lake. So this theme of broken pieces is also quite easy to understand. It's the pieces of oneself, and can often be in relation to a metaphorical broken spirit or sense of self. This theme recurs even in places you wouldn't expect. For example, the Fazbear Fright story Sea Bonnies. And yeah, I'm dead serious. If I'm doing a thorough literary analysis on Remnant as a theme, I might as well touch on all kinds of different examples of it appearing. He realized his thoughts were not really his thoughts anymore. They were fragments. He was having trouble thinking of the people he cared about, his mom, Rory, his friends, and Teresa. He tried to conjure images of them in his head, but he could only see pieces of them. Soon, he'd no longer be anything like what he used to be. How much time did he have left? Maybe minutes, maybe seconds. Of the trillions of cells that had originally made up Mott, he figured only a few thousand were still as they'd been before the Sea Bonnie invasion. Mott managed the last few feet to the clinic door. He reached for it, only to have his hand disintegrate in front of him and drop to the wet concrete. Another honorable mention, kids at play. Dropping the figurine onto his navy and beige Turkish carpet, Joel stomped on the ugly little dude until it broke into multiple pieces. When he noticed the kids at play flag was still unscathed, he reached down, picked it up, and snapped it into 3 pieces. He gave it one last look, ignoring the way the hair bristled at the back of his neck. Then he turned away from it. Leaving aside the terrifying fact that he was no longer in control of his own movement, his body was starting to feel as unyielding as the granite up in the mountains that overlooked the town. Fortunately, though, it didn't feel as strong as the granite. It felt, well, fragile. He felt like, instead of being made of rock or even wood, he was made of some kind of hard plastic. And he felt like he was fragmenting, disconnecting from himself. During whatever length of time he'd been out here, though, he'd noticed his body was starting to feel strained, as if it was reaching some sort of breaking point. He was starting to hear cracks interspersed with the creaks in his movement. Were his bones fracturing? Joel didn't want to see anymore. He couldn't take watching another piece of who he thought he was falling away. Sea Bonnies and Kids at Play utilized the idea of breaking apart in a more literal manner while still functioning as some sort of metaphor. The main character of Sea Bonnies begins to forget the people in his life as both his body and mind fall apart, causing his memories and thoughts, the very essence of a person, to fracture. And the protagonist of Kids at Play breaks the cause of his guilt, being the sign, into pieces, resulting in him then breaking as well. Speaking of breaking, there's also a story titled The Breaking Wheel. Bringing the focus back to emotions for a second, this story has a heavy focus on the power of negative ones. "I hate him," Reed whispered through gritted teeth. From across the aisle of desks, Shelley blew long, dark bangs from her forehead, glanced at the back of Julius's head, and then rolled her eyes at Reed. "Tell me something I don't know." That's how the story starts. Basically, the main character, Reed, decides to trap his bully, Julius, in an exoskeleton Julius made for a class project and leave him there overnight as a way of getting back at him. At the end of the story, Julius, now a mangled living corpse, accidentally having fused with the exoskeleton, comes after Reed for what he did to him. Reed wasn't going to get away from Julius, not even if he made it to the window. Julius was now powered by a robotic framework a mere human couldn't defeat, especially if that mere human was Reed. Plus, Julius now seemed to be supercharged by the monstrosity that he'd become, and that monstrosity had been born of the kind of emotions that propelled humans past their usual limitations. Emotions like pain and fear, emotions like rage. Julius's rage was more powerful than Reed's guilt. Reed didn't stand a chance. So if Julius was now in unspeakable pain because of what Reed did, it made sense that he'd be even more homicidal now. Reed didn't know for sure, but he figured agony brought out the worst in a person. Agony bringing out the worst in a person is seen twice in the story, once at the end and once at the start. Julius's bullying brought out the worst in Reed when he decided to do the unthinkable and trap him in the exoskeleton, which Reed ends up regretting because he knows it was out of character for him. The agony brought out the worst in Reed, too. Agony is an emotion that sort of reflects back on itself. As a result of suffering, it makes you want to cause suffering. This is also stated by Andrew in the epilogues. But I do remember wanting to get back at someone who hurt me. I think I attached myself to him. I got into his soul, made sure he couldn't move on when he should have died. I remember I wanted him to suffer the way he made me suffer, but I don't remember what he did. I just know I hung on no matter what they did to him to try and save him. I wanted him to hurt. FNAF at times will sort of present itself as a cautionary tale on the dangers of human emotion, namely negative ones. Yes, this can also apply to positive emotions. Read the Tales from the Pizzaplex story Bleeding Heart. But the events in FNAF would have never occurred if it wasn't for rage, jealousy, pain, and grief. Holding on to painful memories will only make things worse, so sometimes, some things are best left forgotten. Ah yes, the box. This is the absolute only mystery in FNAF I have ever watched continuously plague and frustrate the community on such a level, after Scott already told us the answer behind it. But then I released part 4, and somehow, no one, not a single person, found the pieces. The story remains completely hidden. I guess most people assume that I filled the game with random Easter eggs this time. I didn't. What's in the box? It's the pieces put together. Putting something back together puts an end to or gives closure to something. You've made it whole, you've completed your mission. And, this is going to sound funny, but the box is closed. Thus, it represents closure, or an end to an era. As I said before, FNAF 6 is the pieces put together, all the souls in one place. On screen, the location appears as a box. In the Tales from the Pizzaplex series, the epilogues take place inside of this location, or metaphorically inside of the box. Jace cleared his throat. He looked up at Adrian. Are we going to ignore what we just heard, or what? Lucia looked at Jace with newfound admiration. Finally, someone was willing to speak about the unspeakable. Adrian rubbed his perfect jaw. His fingers rested on the slight indentation in his square chin. After a couple seconds, he said, "Sometimes talking about things just makes them worse." Wade nodded. "Sorry, forget it," Adrian said. He stopped and swallowed hard. Joel was relieved that was all they said. What good would it do to talk about what had just happened? The characters here tend to want to ignore just how bad their situation is in favor of focusing on survival, or merely trying not to lose their sanity. They choose to leave the horrors forgotten, for now. They obviously can't when the mimic actually chases and kills them, though. Ignoring a problem isn't necessarily going to make it go away. In the original novel trilogy, Henry's house is also a metaphorical box in and of itself. Just be careful, Anjen had said. Some things, some memories, are best left undisturbed. Is that why you kept Dad's house? Charlie thought now. Is that why he kept paying for it, leaving it untouched like some kind of shrine, but never visiting? Henry's house was his final resting place, and what he hoped would be the final resting place of his and William's own creations as well, all contained in one place. And those things were left forgotten. For a while, anyways. Another important theme in FNAF that is tangentially related to Remnant is the idea of history repeating itself. The concept of the Bite Victim's character is the first example of this, because I wouldn't necessarily call him a character, but rather a force that's present across the whole story and pushes it in certain directions. Why is Toy Chica missing her beak? Why is Mangle taken apart? Why is there a second bite? Why is Sister Location repeat of FNAF 4? Oh, wait, I didn't mention that yet, did I? Aren't you the kid who always hides under the table and cries? There's a forced confrontation with Freddy and Bonnie. Unavoidable Foxy jump scare. Please, let me out. Murder by sibling. I'll put you back together and you won't die. Yeah, you get it. It's like the Bite Victim placed a sort of curse on the franchise. A curse of Dreadbear, if you will. This metaphorical curse is placed after the Bite Victim dies in hospital, and he lives on in the pieces of his soul that he left behind in multiple places and characters until those pieces come together and are put to rest in FNAF 6. In The Man Room 1280, this short story sees William Afton quote-unquote die after having been hospitalized, but this death leads to his soul spreading and infecting multiple objects, which go on to terrorize other characters of other stories until the epilogue where they're all brought into one place and put Afton back together. The story of FNAF likes to reiterate ideas again and again, presenting them in different ways, and this both works in a meta sense of trying to make certain concepts or themes clearer, but also an in-universe sense of establishing that if you don't let certain memories or tragedies go, they'll just end up on loop, haunting you forever. Fazbear Entertainment in modern time has become the embodiment of this idea. Because they make light of the past as some fictional story and try to use it as a selling point, it is also keeping that past alive. The Mimic is the embodiment of the consequences of this. It learns, mimics, and recreates the story, this history, unleashing a new evil that is born out of the remnants of the last one. It makes sense then that the backstory of this villain is also going to mirror something we've already known, a story we've already been told. A struggling father pouring his rage and agony over the loss of his child into a robot, giving it life. Unsurprisingly, people have drawn connections with Henry's story from the novel trilogy. Do I think this is intentional? Absolutely. It is something that was done for thematic reasons. The backstory of a character, alternatively titled the storyteller, takes the ideas from a previous story and recreates and repurposes them. This is what the storyteller program itself was created to do. That's its entire reason for existing. The average buffet probably has, 40 or 50 dishes, meats, casseroles, salads, and so on. Most of those are made from the same 10 to 15 or so foods. You can create a virtually endless variety of meals from those few ingredients. We'd use the same principle to create a computer program that would combine various tropes and characters to come up with an endless variety of stories. Asher shook his head. Mark Twain said it a long time ago. There's no such thing as a new idea. Humans may like thinking their imaginations are all that, but really nothing's original anymore. It's all just retelling old stories in a slightly different way. That's why having a computer program do it is so brilliant. Edwin absolutely has narrative connections to Henry, but not literal ones, and the same can be said for Gregory and the Bite Victim. You're broken. I will put you back together. Freddy says, I feel you were broken. And a quote from the story GGY. One of the things I was poking into, Crystal said when she returned her gaze to Tony, was the Pizzaplex animatronics code. I was curious about how their behaviors were chosen, just for fun. But when I was looking at the code, I spotted some strange lines that didn't seem original to the programming. The new lines of code created additional conversations and behaviors in Glamrock Freddy, Chica, Roxy, and Monty. Stuff that wasn't in the legitimate coding. Embedded in those lines of code are seemingly random G's and Y's. What we have here are the letters G and Y, pieces of Gregory's name, scattered across the code of the Glamrocks. Now Gregory fits into the pieces theme. There's a small part of him in every animatronic, or there's a little of him in every body. This game also has you taking a piece from each animatronic and combining them in one place, into one singular vessel. Basically, I love Five Nights at Freddy's. I love its unique story, but I don't think it's told well, which leads to barely anyone understanding it. So if I had to try and break it down into simple terms, I would say it is about the power of emotion and the human soul, exploring both the hopeful and dangerous sides. The catalyst of everything is the Bite Victim. These characters were his friends, and the Fredbear plush tells him, "We are still your friends." Giving those characters life, even in a sick and demented way, was Afton's form of giving life back to his son because of the emotional attachment he had felt towards them. Emotions are part of the soul, and because the son's emotions were connected to these characters, remnants of him would remain immortalized within them. Afton would not have done this out of any genuine love for his son, of course, and rather out of a hatred for humanity. The human soul is sacred, but Afton only sees it as something to exploit and manipulate, and to use as a stepping stone to understand how to achieve immortality. He despises being human, but the question is, was Afton ever really human in the first place? Emotions are still just as prevalent in the new arc, too. When Edwin first creates the Mimic 1 program, he's actually already infused it with some of his own remnant. Edwin was able to take his idea from spark to completion in an amazingly short amount of time. Edwin attributed the speed to the passion he held for the project. Edwin had been so caught up with Fazbear that he'd forgotten what it was like to pour himself into his own creations. He felt like he'd been gasping for air for months, and now he could finally breathe again. Edwin was able to write the code for the program at nearly the speed of light. It was like the program wanted to be written, so it helped him create it. Here, Edwin experiences the joy of creation, but when agony and rage take over, he ends up turning his creation into a monster. And, funnily enough, the best quote to summarize this all actually comes from Chipper and Sons of all places. There comes a time when all of Beaver's rage and sorrow are poured into something, and it becomes stronger than himself. So, circling back to Remnant is actually extremely easy to understand. Have you ever heard of something called the stone tape theory? The stone tape theory is the speculation that ghosts and hauntings are analogous to tape recordings, and that mental impressions during emotional or traumatic events can be projected in the form of energy, recorded onto rocks and other items, and replayed under certain conditions. It was given this title after the idea was popularized by a movie titled The Stone Tape, which I actually watched myself. Plot follows characters believing that a room is haunted, only to come to the realization that the sounds of a woman dying were simply embedded into the stones in the walls, which now occasionally replay it. It isn't haunted by her actual ghost as much as it's just haunted by the memory of her death. The thing that FNAF does is take this idea but make a memory and a ghost the same thing regardless. In FNAF's terms, the sounds of the woman screaming in this film would be referred to as her remnant. It's all that remains of her after her death. Fun fact, there is more fictional media outside of FNAF that actually uses the term remnant to refer to ghosts. There's an in-universe Ghostbusters book called Tobin's Spirit Guide, which categorizes the different kinds of ghosts. One of the classes is Class 6, Elevated Remnant. Just thought that was funny. Anyways, I definitely did not plan for this video to get this long. There's a lot of stuff in relation to the FNAF story that I love talking about, and Remnant is only one of those things. If this felt like it started as a basic explanation that turned into nothing but a mishmash of all the random thoughts about FNAF lore that were coming to my mind, you're absolutely right. Regardless, I hope my words actually made some sort of sense. If they didn't, sorry for wasting your time. Bye.